This is our third session. Thank you for coming back. If you've been with us previously, welcome if you're new. So far, I've been painting in broad brushstrokes to give a widescreen historical survey of the history of the ancient Near East from the closing decades of the Old Testament through to the opening of the New, going from the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC to the death of Herod the Great of Judea in 4 BC. So we weren't hanging around, unlike the gardens of Babylon. In this session, I want to take us back to Babylon to fill in some of the historical details, which will in turn help us in our reading of the relevant Old Testament stories by putting them in their context. Babylon does not stay centre stage in world history for very long. The Lord raised them up for a purpose and then allowed the Medes and the Persians to change the world. Spoiler alert, God wins. As you probably already noticed, I'm a dinosaur in that I live in the past. When I was at school, those countries around the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, such as Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and such like, were labelled as the Near East. Those countries around the Persian Gulf, such as Iran and Iraq, were the Middle East. Then came the Indian subcontinent, which includes Pakistan and Bangladesh, one country when I was at school, and east of India was the Far East. It seems that some authorities have done away with the Near East and have enlarged the Middle East to include what used to be the Near East as well. In my opinion, this is unhelpful, so I will continue to distinguish between the Near and Middle East, and I'm pretty sure that none of our classes in this series will take us to the Far East. Alexander the Great did get to the border of India, although that's a story for a later class. Another pedantic point is that I prefer to use the traditional God-honouring dating conventions of before Christ, or BC, and Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, or AD for short. I find BCE and CE offensive if they stand for Common Era, and unnecessary if they stand for Christian Era. I know that the world is against me in this, but then the world is against Christians most of the time, so we'll have to learn to muddle along together as best we can. So, to Babylon. But before we reach Babylon, we have to go a step further backwards in time. We could start at Babel, but Genesis 11 is too far back for a series on the time between the Testaments. There was an old Babylonian kingdom way, way back, but this was overwhelmed by the Assyrians from further north in the Mesopotamian Valley. So when we talk about Babylon in Old Testament times, we actually mean Neo-Babylonia, which distinguishes it from the older kingdoms that occupied the same territory, but which do not impact the Old Testament story. Also, we need to distinguish between Babylon, the city, one of the great cities of the ancient world, and the nation of Babylon that surrounds it. Both are in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers being the Tigris to the north and Euphrates to the south. Eventually, the rivers merge to the southeast of Babylon and flow into the Persian Gulf, where today we find Kuwait. With the Persian Gulf being part of the Indian Ocean, we can place Babylon in the Middle East rather than the Near East, although the expansionist Babylonian kings often looked west towards the Mediterranean when they sought to extend the borders of their kingdom. The dominant power in the ancient Near East before the rise of the Babylonians was the Assyrian Empire. It was the Assyrians that came down like a wolf on the fold, if you remember Lord Byron's poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib from 1815. They were unable to conquer the southern Hebrew kingdom of Judah, but it was the Assyrians that defeated the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. They took away many of the surviving Jews into the heartland of their empire, where they disappeared into the melting pot of the local population, hence the lost tribes of Israel. Some say lost in the sense that they wandered around the ancient world until they found places to settle. I would describe them as lost in the sense that they were annihilated by the Assyrians, lost without trace. The Assyrians later relocated other captive people to the ruins of Israel, where they intermarried with Hebrew survivors and became the Samaritans, who we meet again in the New Testament. Having served their purpose in God's great plan, the Assyrians were soon replaced as the dominant power in the region by an alliance of Medes and Chaldeans. The Medes were an Indo-European race. In some older books, the word Aryan might be used, but since the Nazis misappropriated the word in their quest for racial purity, it's probably best to retire the word Aryan and stick with Indo-European. Thus, the Medes were ethnically similar to the Persians, and indeed the ancient Greek historians used the terms interchangeably, hence the Medes and the Persians. The Median homeland had been the Zagros Mountains of Iran, to the northeast of Mesopotamia. Their capital, Ecbatana, is today the modern city of Hamadan in Iran. It was the Chaldean ruler, Nabopolassar, who began what we know as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, when he formed an alliance with the Median king, Cyaxares, and overthrew the Assyrians. Nineveh, the great Assyrian city that had once been visited by the prophet Jonah around the year 760 BC, fell to the Medes and Babylonians in 612 BC. The remnants of the Assyrian army clung on in the northeast of their territory for a few more years, but by 609 BC they were gone and Assyria was no more. By the way, do not worry too much about these names and dates. If you need to check them later, a good Bible dictionary or Old Testament introduction will fill in the details for you. For now, just go with the flow and see how God controlled these nations to serve his purposes. The alliance between the Medes and the Chaldeans was cemented by the marriage of Cyaxares' daughter Amytis to Nabopolassar's son Nebuchadrezzar, later known as Nebuchadrezzar or Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar wanted his new bride to feel at home in Babylon, so with no expense spared, had gardens built to replicate the mountainous environment of her homeland to the north. While the evidence for these hanging gardens is ambiguous, it would theoretically be possible for a wooden piston pump powered by a water wheel to raise river water high enough up the terraces to irrigate the plants. And there was certainly sufficient water in the Euphrates, so the hanging gardens of Babylon have entered the popular imagination as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The city walls were also noteworthy. They were said to be 75 feet high and 30 feet wide, so wide enough for two chariots to pass one another. The walls were fortified with crenellated battlements and towers 100 feet tall, and the whole length was decorated with brightly coloured tiles, so that from a distance The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar shimmered like baubles of lapis strung upon a necklace of gold, it was said. Meanwhile, to the southwest of Judah, Pharaoh Necho of Egypt was worried about the balance of power in the region. At first, he supported the tottering Assyrian Empire against the new alliance of the Medes and the Chaldeans and sent troops north through Judah. In a misguided attempt to stop the Egyptian army helping the hated Assyrians, King Josiah of Judah lost his life at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC. This is recorded in 2 Kings 23. 4 years later, in 605 BC, Necho went to war against Nebuchadnezzar, whose army defeated the Egyptian army at the fords of the Euphrates at Carchemish. Egypt now withdrew back to its African heartland along the River Nile, leaving their former vassal states to the mercy of the Babylonians. The precise chronology of the Babylonian attacks on Judah in general and Jerusalem in particular is a technical challenge that I do not intend to examine in what is intended to be a survey. We have written records from both sides, the latter parts of the books of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles in particular, plus some historical sections of prophetic books such as Isaiah and Jeremiah. Also, there are Babylonian records to include, along with the findings of archaeologists. Putting them all together is like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle without knowing whether you have all the pieces and without the help of seeing the picture on the box. Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem in 597 BC and again in 587 or possibly 586 BC, depending on which calendar was being used. And either in 587 or 586, Solomon's temple was destroyed. The reasons why Babylon attacked and devastated Judah are found in the final chapters of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. In brief, after good King Josiah died at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC, there were no more godly kings in Judah. The prophets were ignored or even ridiculed, and the priests had become too worldly, so the people had no shepherds to guide them. As the end of Judah drew ever closer, the Babylonians took captives away to work in other parts of their empire. Unlike the Assyrians, the Babylonians did not try to repopulate by bringing in other people to replace the captives, leaving Judah desolate and relatively empty. The Edomites occupied southern Judah and were condemned by the prophet Obadiah. And when we meet King Herod at the start of the New Testament, we will be reminded that his family were of Edomite descent. After the fall of Jerusalem in 587, which I think is a more likely date than 586 BC, we see two strands of Judaism emerging. There were some Hebrews left in and around the ruined city of Jerusalem. Read Lamentations for an idea of how bleak their situation was. And there were Hebrews trying to make their way in exile, where they wept by the rivers of Babylon, as the psalmist writes in Psalm 137. Those of a certain age might remember how this psalm was turned into a jolly pop song by Boney M in 1978, actually a cover of an earlier version by the Melodians in 1972. Both versions were a jaunty cross between Jamaican reggae and Europop and were entirely unsuited to the original words from Psalm 137. If Psalm 137 is going to be sung in a modern style, it should be the blues. This is a sad song, a song of despair, and yet with a glimmer of hope behind the dark clouds. And one of the nastiest verses in the Bible at the end. Read it sometime. Also living in Babylon after 587 were some young Hebrew noblemen named Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But they had their names changed in Babylon to Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these four did well for themselves. Ezekiel was also an exile in Babylon. And when we reach the Persian period, we will meet Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and many other faithful Jews, some of which had not been born in Judah. More on them another time. Nebuchadnezzar was the last powerful king of the Neo-Babylonians. His successors seemed keen to enjoy the benefits of power without working particularly hard to maintain it. Summarizing Babylonian history is made more challenging by the fact that the Hebrew versions of the names of the later kings differ from the Babylonian names. Most of us can cope with Nebuchadrezzar being the same as Nebuchadnezzar, but his successors of Evil Merodach, also known as Amel-Marduk, Nergal-Sharezer or Nergalisa in Greek, Labashi-Marduk, and finally Nabonidus are all difficult for English speakers, although expecting ancient kings of Babylon to have English names is, of course, somewhat silly. We meet Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, in the book of Daniel, where he is depicted as vain and disrespectful and gets his comeuppance at the hands of the Persians of Cyrus. While Babylonia had stagnated, the powers to the north had been busy. In 550 BC, the Medes and the Persians met in battle. The Persians were outnumbered, but were led by a tactical genius, Cyrus, later known as the Great. Having defeated the Medes, Cyrus showed himself to be a canny politician. Rather than humiliate his vanquished enemies, he had himself declared as king of Media and governed the two nations as equal partners, with each enjoying equal rights. Babylon now faced a united nation on its northern border, and in 539, Belshazzar's feast was interrupted and Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians of Cyrus. When we read the Old Testament, we do so with the benefit of knowing where the story is heading. Sooner or later, the exile will be over. We know this because the New Testament opens with a functioning temple in Jerusalem and Jewish people living in Galilee able to travel to Bethlehem to register for a census and later being regular visitors at the temple in Jerusalem. But the Jews who were living in exile did not know that it was going to come to an end, even if they had heard and understood the hints from the prophets Daniel and Ezekiel. So the exiles had to get on and learn how to be Jews in a strange land. And some succeeded. Of course, we have no idea how many Jewish exiles fell by the wayside. Perhaps they learned a new language, married a local, and forgot their heritage, and their children may not even know that one parent had not been born in Babylon. And, like the Israelites taken to Assyria, these Judahites were assimilated into the host nation. But some kept the faith. Daniel and his companions, for example, were trained up to become Babylonian civil servants. This would mean learning the local language, Aramaic. Aramaic is from the same language family as Hebrew, both being northwestern Semitic languages, as a very rough guide, about as close to one another as, say, Spanish and Italian. So, with some words in common and both following a similar grammatical structure. And as time passed, more and more Hebrews spoke Aramaic as their first language and had to learn Hebrew in order to read their scriptures. By New Testament times, Hebrew was a dying language, spoken only in and around Jerusalem. One of the first elements of the story of Daniel and his friends is found in Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 to 18. Here it is from the Message. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself by eating the king's food or drinking his wine, so he asked the head of the palace staff to exempt him from the royal diet. The head of the palace staff, by God's grace, liked Daniel, but he warned him, "I'm afraid of what my master the king will do. He is the one who assigned this diet, and if he sees that you are not as healthy as the rest, he'll have my head." But Daniel appealed to a steward who'd been assigned by the head of the palace staff to be in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Try us out for 10 days on a simple diet of vegetables and water. Then compare us with the young men who eat from the royal menu. Make your decision on the basis of what you see." The steward agreed to do it and fed them vegetables and water for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked better and more robust than all the others who'd been eating from the royal menu. So the steward continued to exempt them from the royal menu of food and drink and served them only vegetables. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and skill in both books and life. In addition, Daniel was gifted in understanding all sorts of visions and dreams. At the end of the time set by the king for their training, the head of the royal staff brought them in to Nebuchadnezzar. When the king interviewed them, he found them far superior to all the other young men. None were a match for Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Great story. And could this be the beginnings of what today we know as the Jewish kosher diet? Most non-Jews know that Jews will not eat pork, and Bible students know that the list of clean, kosher, and unclean, treif, is more complicated than just not eating pork. Whether Daniel and co were merely on a healthy eating kick, or whether they were trying their best to live as God's people in a new land, is a matter of debate. But it worked for them, and generations of Jews living in a Gentile world would take encouragement from the story. And as we read on in Daniel, we see how the 3 friends were blessed when they refused to bow to an idol, and how Daniel was saved from punishment when he continued to pray, even when ordered by the laws of the Medes and the Persians to desist. There was a lot going on in the period of the exile. Not everything is made clear, but we can make educated deductions. For example, when we reach the New Testament, we meet rabbis, teachers of the law. Jesus was sometimes addressed as rabbi, a mark of respect. But we do not meet any rabbis in the Old Testament. Priests and prophets, yes, but where did the rabbis come from? Some believe that they became necessary during the exile. The priests had suffered particularly badly when Jerusalem was destroyed, and with the temple in ruins, there was no need for a special group of people to conduct sacrifices. Instead, the survivors started to offer a different form of worship, a sacrifice of prayer and praise, with animals no longer being killed on the altar in the Jerusalem temple. Scholars of the written word took the lead in worship. Torah was read and explained. Psalms were sung, and sung, so far as we can tell, without the use of musical instruments. Prayers were said, and the people gathered together in assemblies to do these things collectively. We know these assemblies by a Greek word, synagogue, a gathering, an assembly, a congregation, and only in specific contexts does it mean a building for Jewish worship. Like the original meaning of church, it refers to the people and what they do, not where they meet to do it. An empty synagogue and an empty church are just empty buildings. Only when the congregation congregates and worships God or teaches from his word is it truly a synagogue or church. Like rabbis, we meet synagogues in the New Testament, both in Galilee, in the Gospels, and around the Roman Empire in Acts. And there's no hint as to when and where they started. The inference seems logical that synagogue worship originated in the exile when temple worship was no longer an option. But if there is conclusive proof that this is the case, the news has yet to reach me. However, in Elephantine in Egypt, something different occurred. Elephantine was an island in the River Nile, located close to where the Aswan Dam is found today, 430 miles south of Cairo. During the exilic period, there was a garrison of mercenaries employed by the Persian governor of Egypt to defend the southern frontier. Some of these soldiers were Hebrew mercenaries. This, of course, makes them unusual in that, so far as we know, Hebrews did not tend to serve in other nations' armies. It is, of course, possible that Hebrew mercenaries were to be found all over the place, and it's only the unique situation of Elephantine, where papyrus documents have been preserved in the dry Egyptian desert, that tells us about this one particular situation. Perhaps Elephantine is unique, or perhaps it can speak for other Hebrew groups in other parts of the world whose records have not reached us. We can see that not all the Jews at Elephantine were Orthodox, that's Orthodox with a small o. They were, technical word alert, syncretic in their beliefs and included other gods, so-called, in their worship. This was the type of religion that Jeremiah spoke against in chapter 44. What is particularly surprising about these Jews in Egypt is that they had their own temple, where they worshipped Yahweh with burnt offerings, flour offerings, flour as in what we make bread with, not flowers that bloom in the spring, tra-la, and also incense. The building was stone, not mud brick, with a cedarwood roof and contained gold and silver utensils. However, this Jewish worship deep in the heart of Egypt annoyed some of the locals, and in 400 BC, the priests of the Egyptian god Khnum led an attack on the temple that left it ruined and with the treasures stolen. This attack occurred while the Persian governor was out of the country, and it took the Jewish leaders at Elephantine several years to gain permission to rebuild. They also wrote to the Persian governor in Jerusalem, as well as the high priest there. Eventually, they were allowed to build a smaller altar house rather than a full-blown temple, and told they could offer grain and incense but not burnt offerings. Later correspondence finds the Elephantine priests asking their colleagues in Jerusalem how to calculate the correct date for Passover. All of this parallels the correspondence between Jerusalem and the Persian High King recorded in the book of Ezra. and confirms that the Persian authorities took an interest in religious affairs and tended, where they could, to support local decisions so long as there was no impact on national security. While Elephantine is probably not a typical Jewish community, it does tell us to expect the unexpected. As we'll see next session, it was possible for a nice Hebrew girl to become Queen of Persia. We're talking about Hadassah, Myrtle in translation, or Ishtar in Persian, Esther. And when we look at Acts chapter 2, we read about Jews, faithful Jews, who were willing and able to travel as pilgrims to Jerusalem at Passover and stay on for Pentecost. They came from, quote, Parthia, Elam, Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, that's the Roman province of that name, found at the western end of modern Turkey and including the city of Ephesus, Phrygia, Egypt, parts of Libya, including Cyrene, Rome, Crete, and Arabia. This is from verses 9 to 11 of Acts 2. And if you do not recognize some of these places, get yourself a Bible atlas and use it. This dispersal of Jews around and beyond the Roman Empire has a technical name, the diaspora. And by the time of the New Testament, there were probably more Jews living away from Judea than within. There's still a diaspora to this day. More Jews live in the USA than in Israel, for example. Many diaspora Jews have assimilated within their local community. They no longer speak Aramaic. No one has for centuries. And Yiddish, that unique language that had Germanic roots but incorporated Hebrew and Slavonic words and was spoken widely by European Jews and their descendants in North America, is now in decline. Although some words are widely recognized in non-Jewish circles. If you enjoy your nosh, food, that's Yiddish. And if you clumsily drop your plate, you're a klutz, more Yiddish, oy vey. The most widely spoken language by Jews today is English, although Hebrew has been revived and modernized and is widely spoken in Israel. And many Jews still prefer to study their scriptures in Hebrew. This has been the case since the exile, not for speaking of English, but speaking the local language when out and about and using Hebrew in the home and synagogue. So under the Babylonians and Persians, Aramaic, under the Greeks and Romans, Greek. It was during the exile that certain elements of Jewishness became entrenched. So boy babies were circumcised on the 8th day. Traditional Hebrew names were used. Sabbath was kept. Food laws were observed. I've already used the word kosher and assumed most of us know what it means, and that it means more than avoiding pork. The high holy days are kept and often anchored to scripture. So, to work our way through the Jewish year, Rosh Hashanah is New Year and occurs in September or October. The Jewish calendar is lunar, so dates move around as we remember from the date of Easter moving each year to follow Passover. The holiest festival is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This is a period of fasting and reflection at the end of the New Year festivities. In Bible times, the festival culminated with the high priest making a sacrifice in the Holy of Holies. This, of course, could not happen without a temple or tabernacle, so diaspora Jews would make atonement through repentance. Although it was not unknown for the rabbi to offer a small animal sacrifice, such as a chicken, but that is generally exceptional, not the majority practice. The faithful worshipper will fast for 24 hours, spending much of the time in the synagogue wearing a white robe as a symbol of purity. At the end of the fast, the believer will consider him or herself to have been spiritually reborn. 5 days after Yom Kippur comes Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. This is the first harvest festival of the year, the others being Passover and Pentecost. During Sukkot, believers remember how God cared for them by providing all their needs, including manna and quail, throughout the 40 years in the wilderness. They make little tabernacles out of branches and camp out for a week, giving Sukkot a holiday feel. In warmer climates, the family might sleep out overnight. Where it is colder, they will eat in the family tabernacle but sleep indoors. And in Bible times, pilgrims would travel to Jerusalem for Yom Kippur and stay on for Sukkot. The next festival is usually a synagogue meeting to celebrate the law, although it is possible to observe the day at home if there's no local synagogue within a Sabbath day journey. This is Simchat Torah, celebrating or rejoicing in the law. During the year, the entire Torah is read in synagogue, starting with the creation story in Genesis and continuing through to the close of Deuteronomy. At Simchat Torah, the final passage in Deuteronomy is read, followed immediately by returning to the beginning of Genesis. In a synagogue, the scrolls of the Torah will be paraded around the building with song and dance, and it can be a lively, joyous occasion. The Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, is not found in the Old Testament, although it may be referred to in the New. It dates back to the events of the Maccabean rebellion in the 2nd century BC, which we will be looking at in greater detail in a few weeks' time, Lord willing. Hanukkah is celebrated in mid to late December, and many non-religious people see it as a sort of Hebrew Christmas and will send Happy Hanukkah cards. Each day, one of the 8 candles on the menorah will be lit, and back while there was still a temple in Jerusalem, a giant menorah was lit in the courtyard, which could be seen throughout the city. It was during Hanukkah that Jesus announced that he was the light of the world. His disciples took the point. Purim follows Hanukkah in late February or early March. We will look at the establishment of this festival next week when we meet Esther in Susa, one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire. Purim means lots, as in the lots cast by the wicked Persian Haman to decide the date when he would initiate a massacre of lots of Jews throughout the empire. Spoiler alert, he fails and the Jews get their revenge. Purim is a festive day, with the Book of Esther being read aloud with a pantomime feel. The goodies get cheered and the baddies are booed, and special cakes called Hamantaschen are eaten. Oh, yes, they are. The best known of all the annual festivals is Passover, or to use its Hebrew name, Pesach. It's a spring festival and usually coincides with Easter. It is a reminder of the deliverance of the children of Israel from slavery in Egypt, as reported in the book of Exodus. A symbolic meal is eaten. This is called Seder, meaning order, as the dishes have to be served in a particular order, with the story of the events of the Exodus being told. Today, even the most nominal of Jews will commemorate Pesach in some way, but there were times in the Old Testament when it seems to have been completely forgotten. After 7 weeks of mourning comes Shavuot, or Pentecost, from the 50 days since Pesach. It is also the harvest festival of first fruits. Shavuot celebrates the giving of the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, and in synagogue services the building is decorated with fruit and flowers, and the Ten Commandments are read aloud. And in the first Shavuot after the resurrection of Jesus, the gospel was preached publicly for the first time, as recorded in Acts 2. The liturgical year concludes with Tishba B'Av in late July or early August. This is not found in either testament in the Bible, as it commemorates an event that happened later, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in AD 70. For obvious reasons, it is a somber event with many Jews fasting and all ornaments removed from synagogues. All of these festivals work without animals being killed, so neither priests nor temple are required. Instead, the celebrations can occur in homes or in synagogues, and all are observed by some Jews and some are observed by most. But Judaism could and does function away from Jerusalem and with no requirement for priests and Levites serving in a temple. And it was the exile in Babylon that taught the Jews that this was the case. For those that lived through the catastrophe of the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar's mighty Babylonian army, the years that followed were traumatic. It seemed as though God had forgotten his people. Read Lamentations for a taste of how bitter that time was. But God was in control. His covenant with his people was conditional. It uses a little word with a lot of impact. If. If you keep God's commandments, you will live long and prosper. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the point. But if you ignore God's word, whether the written Torah of Moses or the words spoken by God's messengers, the prophets, then there will be consequences. The exile was a tough time for the chosen people, but those that survived were able to rebuild and, when the time was right, return to the promised land, as we shall see next week. As a concluding thought to the necessity of the exile, I take some wise words by C.S. Lewis and put them into this different context. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. The exile and Babylonian captivity were painful, but those with the ears to hear heard and understood why it had to happen. And when the time was right, God moved once more and delivered his people. So thank you for your attention. I'll have a look at any chat messages and take any questions in just a moment. But first of all, we'll close this part of the evening with another prayer. Then we'll have a quick reminder of what's on the horizon in the British Bible School world, and then we can have a chat. So let's pray.